Okay, greetings everyone. If you clicked on this looking for news, this is not an update. Just a little something from my book club. Me and a couple of my boys read this ginormous book, about 1,162 pages for a little book club thing. So this is just a summary of that for Bobby and Eddie, and hopefully you can... I needed to review this anyway. I got the Cliff Notes. I listened to it twice, basically. But it's been a while, and since we had to move the meeting a couple of times, I figured if I'm going to read it, I might as well read it and record it so you guys could listen to it and as you're running around. So hopefully it will refresh things for you if you're up for it. So just turn it on in the background or do it while you're driving or exercising or whatever. Of course, starting out the first chapter, the author does kind of jump on Robert Moses. He's born in 1888. He's on the Yale swim team and he threatens to quit. Basically, they say, go ahead. They call this bluff, and he never swam for them again. And the author kind of uses that as a unifying theme throughout the book. But as Caro describes Moses, he did have a huge influence, especially over New York in the 20th century. He was the visionary behind parks, dams, schools, bridges, parkways, highways, housing developments, and government buildings. I'm just reading my little highlight points here, so hopefully this shouldn't be too long. But Moses was also corrupt and wasteful. He lived like an emperor of, according to Caro, quote, his own sovereign state, because he was able to craft legislation and protect himself, and people didn't take the time to look at what he was writing. He just ran with it, okay? People have lots of feelings about these things, and we can talk about them, some really good stuff. But anyway, so yeah, we don't know if he wasted hundreds of millions or hundreds of thousands, but he was not accountable for any of it, which is kind of one of the essential ingredients, right, in good government, making sure that people are not burning stuff up. However, we'll have some good discussions about this, but Moses also used gossip, scandal, and spies to destroy the reputations of anyone who challenged him. As he built up, once he got powerful, he lost an early job, but once he got powerful, once he got some leverage, he continued to do that to get shit done. And also, so a lot of times, just to kind of push people around. And he definitely had a real arrogant air to him. One thing I love about both of you guys is, like, you've been involved in massive projects, but we always listen and understand that, somebody might be able to find something that we did wrong or add something helpful. He was very hard-headed. But again, back in the 30s and 40s, that wasn't unusual. But that was definitely one of his Achilles' heels. So he was a little bit, not a little bit, he was definitely, arrogant, but did lots of great things. So, Part 1, Chapter 1 summary, line of succession, born December 18th, 1888. His mother, Bella, married a department store owner, a guy named Emmanuel Moses, in 1886. Bella insisted that her husband sell the store and move the family to New York City in 1887, right before Moses was born. The reason? Mama Bella thought there was, quote, no cultural activity in New Haven. Bella felt she grew up on the Lower East Side, or through a lot of Jewish people, in the Lower East Side tenements, and she was a little afraid of poor people, as lots of wealthy people are. And she worried that the poor folks on the Lower East Side would give a false impression that the Jewish people were not, quote unquote, respectable. And again, back in this day and age, the Victorian era just ended. There's lots of concern about class and who's right and who tips a hat to who. I mean, all that shit was like daily on the menu. And when people had power and when people were in charge, they were the fucking boss, right? It was a very different world. But Moses did go to Yale, got his PhD over in Great Britain, and he was denied into many clubs and stuff like that, Moses was, because he was Jewish at Yale, and he was able to kind of blend in better over in London. That was Chapter 2. But he also, in Chapter 2, claims he's going to go into public service to, quote, change the world. Chapter 3, he spent a year at Oxford. He studied the British civil service, mostly run by a wealthy elite of Oxford and Cambridge. Again, so the civil service and the way it was run and structured, right, as most cultures are. The powerful or rich are the ones that set it up. But it was mostly run by Oxford and Cambridge graduates, and this provided Moses with the template for how he believed American civil government should run. He maintained, quote, supreme contempt, unquote, for people of color, extreme supreme contempt for people of color. Again, page 51, according to Arthur Carroll. Moses wrote his PhD on the civil service of Great Britain. So his doctorate was focused on the civil service in Great Britain. So that's kind of interesting too. Moses studied for a year over in Berlin, Germany, then before returning to New York in 1912. At that time, he's about 24 years old. Okay, all of us still playing softball, but I think Eddie probably got his master's in Columbia by then, and Bob, you probably had 1 or 1.5 masters by then too, but he's 24 years old in 1912. Chapter 4. During the 20th century, the progressive movement kind of took over, just in the early part. It kind of craps out early, but reform movements sprang up in almost every large city in the U.S. That's on page 60. The Bureau of Municipal Research, which launched studies into government corruption, so people actually studied this, right? And this is when efficiency and management really exploded at the tail end of the Industrial Revolution. As this was going on, and Moses applied to this bureau, the Bureau of Municipal Research, and he got a job. Privately, Moses studied derelict parts of the city like Riverside Park and dreamed about how he would reshape the city if he had the chance. He began to criticize the Bureau's procedure that was very slow. He was frustrated, right? As we all know. Any kind of organization, especially a big one, trying to make changes, everything he's trying to do is really sluggish and slow. So again, as most people would be, he was frustrated. He stopped showing up to his job, and rumors got around that Mary Louise Sims, the secretary in the office, that's where he met his wife, and he fell in love with her. So I'm not sure how that part wraps up. But in 1913, John Poroy Mitchell was elected as mayor, and Moses was suggested to him as a, quote, expert in civil service. So I guess he still was with that bureau, but he ends up getting a job with the mayor, whose name I never heard of, John Poroy Mitchell. Chapter 5. Moses set out to reform New York City's civil service, page 71. He found that civil service was in a chaotic state of disarray. Shocker. He recommended a complete overhaul, and he wanted each job based on technical ability rather than nepotism, right, or who you know. As he grew closer to Mary, they got married in 1915. He became hated by workers who owed their jobs to Tammany, right? So Tammany was still pretty powerful. We all heard about Boss Tweed. Boss Tweed gets arrested eventually and spends the last of his life in jail. But Tammany still hung around. It was not anything quite as monstrous as what Tweed did, but it was still the thing. By 1917, progressivism in the city, though, was dead. That's on page 84. Around this time, Moses' wife Mary gave birth to a second kid. The family was suffering financially, though, and Al Smith was then elected to governor of New York, and Moses' fortune was about to change. So again, Moses' family's getting a little bigger, and finances are getting tight, and this is when Al Smith comes along. So, chapter 6. Belle Moskowitz came from Eastern Europe. By the time she reached out to Moses in 1818, she had established herself as the most important political advisor to the new governor, Al Smith. Again, she comes up a lot in the book, right? This was a very smart, very capable woman, and she was a big part of Al Smith's, and she taught Moses a lot. Anyway, so Smith was an idiosyncratic politician. He was a street guy, a Lower East Side guy, pretty rough around the edges, but extremely smart and very good at what he did. And while he resembled a typical Tammany Democrat, he was very much his own man. So he was not totally beholden to them. And again, he was actually even open to the idea of reform, which, again, if you don't remember anything about Tammany, was just off the charts. But since Al Smith was a kid of the streets, he appealed a lot to the common man and the people in the city, and they understood him, and he came across as genuine when he wanted to make shit better, right? He wasn't just saying, screw everything, but he was saying we can't just, appoint every knucklehead we know to a job, and he was actually pretty reasonable about trying to make changes, and people were open to it. Chapter 7. The friendship between Bob Moses and Al Smith grew. Al Smith grew up in the slums. He left school at 13. He educated himself by reading law, reading the bills themselves. Every time a bill came up, and he eventually became known as the guy who knew everything. So while people assumed he was part of the corrupt Tammany machine, Al Smith. He turned down job offers and rewards, so Smith really was his own man. In March 1911, 141 people died in the sweatshop fire in New York, which was the book we read last spring, right? Talked about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. After that is when Smith and Moses jumped on it and tried to help make some very real and meaningful changes. So Moses' friendship with Governor Smith helped to change him as well. Smith hired Moses to work on a good government project. Under the tutelage of Smith and Moskowitz, Moses changed from a young idealist to a man, quote, willing to deal with political considerations. On page 135 if you want to check it out. And Al Smith was reelected in 1922. Chapter 8, Moses became a key figure in capital maneuvering. Again, now we're up in Albany. He's with Al Smith in the legislature, making stuff happen, getting stuff done. Page 173. Moses dined with Smith several times a week and was a member of his inner circle. Of some cute little stories in the book about singing and hanging out, and they really became very, very good friends. It's odd, this completely rough around the edges poor kid from the Lower East Side and this rich Jewish guy who grew up in New Haven became legitimately close, which is one of my favorite things about the book. But in the process of studying all these laws while Smith is governor, Moses also became the best bill drafter in the state. Page 141 for looking. For a long time, Moses refused any of Smith's offers of high-paying government positions. Eventually, however, he told Smith that he wanted, quote, parks, on page 142. Chapter 9, A Dream. Moses recognized the need for parks and the vast highway systems that would be needed to support public's access to parks. I guess that's where the name Parkway came from, right? It was just fun to look at, and also then use them to get to the beautiful parks. He focused, as we all love the stories, especially on Jones Beach on the South Shore. He imagined a public beach less than 25 miles from Times Square. That's on page 161. Sorry if you heard my dog. Candy, shush. And he asked for $15 million to launch this ambitious project. And that was a ton of money back in the 1920s. $15 million. Part 4, Chapter 11, jumping a little bit, Majesty of the Law. In 1923, and the $15 million that Moses required was an issue. Okay, he was asking for $15 million. The money would be available to him in 1925, 2 years later. But Moses was impatient. Smith set aside $225,000 and let him begin the project, and Moses immediately spent $63,000 setting up lavish offices and hiring trusted friends. Moses could be very charming, especially initially, but he became curt and arrogant with anyone who stood in his way or if you disagreed with him. He was very, he was rude and kind of mean and got, very testy. Moses used the government-backed legal system to delay and obfuscate any of the legal challenges to his projects. He simultaneously waged a war in the press against the little group of wealthy men who were trying to protect their land as he was developing the Jones Beach and the parkways out there. Chapter 12, Robert Moses and the Creature of the Machine. The parkways meant real estate transactions. So that's page 207. So he knew, Moses, to do Jones Beach and the parkways, it was going to be all about real estate. Meaning the people with foreknowledge of the plans could also buy cheap real estate in the current moment and sell it to the government for good money later as that need got driven up immediately. Since many people could make a great deal of money, Moses could exchange this profitable foreknowledge for political favors. Smith would not run for election in 1926, and I'm not sure where that one finished up, and admitting that they did not read his legislation in enough detail. And Moses used this a lot. He realized he should get things started. And when people sort of gave him seed money for a big project, then he would turn it around on them and say, well, you don't want to turn around and admit you didn't read my bill carefully enough. You're not going to not give me another $250,000 because you gave me $200,000 without reading this bill. Again, that's kind of brutal, but it's effective and it's true. Chapter 13, by the end of 1928, there were 14 parks in New York City, as opposed to just one in 1924. Yeah, so that's a good place that's chapter 13 we're at now, right? So by the end of 1828, there were 14 parks in New York when there used to be really one. in 1924. Pretty decent track record just right there. And again, I'm jumping around. Some of these things I didn't highlight much, or they were just kind of big general things that we knew. Chapter 17, the mother of accommodation. Moses opened the Southern State Parkway with great fanfare. That's right around between page, right around 305. Chapter 16, chapter 19, I got some highlights. Chapter 19, to power in the city. There was a fusion party that nominated a little-known half-Jewish, I didn't know that about LaGuardia. LaGuardia was half-Jewish, half-Italian, and the fusion party nominated him. LaGuardia trusted Moses and knew he was great at writing legislation, and not realizing that Moses was using his talents as a bill drafter to give himself almost unprecedented power. So again, LaGuardia gave him great latitude, and unfortunately, Moses then wrote it to his advantage. Again, this is a little squirrely, but it's fucked up. It's also legal because he's writing it. People aren't reading it carefully, including the legislators, right? Even back then, they didn't read the whole bill a lot, and that's how it works. So chapter 20, summary, it's called 1 year. In 1934, Governor Lehman officially made Moses the first commissioner of the citywide parks department. So that's it, 1934. Now he's actually commissioner of the citywide parks department. Moses was able to, quote, see opportunities everywhere and build parks, playgrounds, and a zoo in Central Park. That's around page 377. At the time, the Triborough Bridge was also being built. The colossal project was the biggest endeavor in Moses' career so far, allowing him to tie together three boroughs, right? The Bronx, Manhattan, and Queens. We all benefited from that as young people, right? Chapter 21, the candidate. Moses was convinced to run for governor of New York in 1934, and I think we can say that was probably one of the worst ideas ever. He was completely impolitic. He had no patience, and he had built up that arrogance was really coming through. He had gotten enough power at that point where he was like annoyed with people, and he went from being sort of a darling of the press to being really an aggravation to the press, and really, he couldn't stand them. He argued with the press and refused to, quote, pander to the people. That's on page 410. Chapter 22, order number 129. President Roosevelt, who didn't get along with Moses, right? Initially, they couldn't stand each other. But they figured out a way to work together ultimately. And he told LaGuardia that he wanted Moses out. He just couldn't stand him. But LaGuardia was really dependent and afraid of Moses. This is all around page 430 if you want to check some of the details. Moses leaked the plot against him. They came up with this plot to get rid of him because he couldn't be fired. He had crafted his own legislation, his own job description and whatever. And but Moses made himself look like a hero fighting against this bad guy president trying to cut him loose. So Moses won that war. And again, the lesson learned there that was kind of creepy was you could do something to Moses, but, even the president had trouble doing it. We'll find out later. Part 4, chapter 23. LaGuardia began to master the role of mayor of New York City. He struggled a little bit early, but he began to kind of assert his authority over Moses, and he did get bullied and jerked around by him, but he was able to work with him and kind of even joked about the fact that Moses was always threatening to quit, and even joked about that with him directly, whereas everyone else kind of shut down. Chapter 24, driving. Moses planned to remake New York City. He had to search elsewhere for funding and manpower, and some of that looked like it could come at this time from the New Deal projects, because in the 30s, as much as he hated Roosevelt, lots of money was being put together to do things which we know, like infrastructure, which were massive help across the country, and that he was able to fully take advantage of. Frequently, Moses also lied about the true cost and scope of his building projects. To reshape the city, he knocked down communities and buildings that existed for decades. Okay, we can get into the details and skim over them, but yeah, there was some pretty rough stuff happening there. People's relationships with all automobiles around this time also changed. Cars were no longer a pursuit for comfortable middle class or wealthy fathers, to quote the book, but it was an essential part of a daily commute, page 483. And no matter what they did, right, we joked around about this a little already, I think, that no matter what happens, you build a better bridge, you build a better parkway, you just end up getting more cars. which is exactly what happened. The thing that was fascinating too is that even in the late 20s, early 30s, this was a problem, which is pretty amazing. So part 5, the love of power. Chapter 25, though, changing. Arrogance was a fundamental part of Moses' personality. His addiction to power was becoming another equally essential part of him. And again, I think this is way too heavy-handed. This is the guy summarizing Carol's point. Power allowed him to mock and antagonize others without fear of reprisal. He enjoyed ruining people. And again, we saw that even with his brother. He was outright cruel to his brother, I would say. He was happy threatening people and ignoring anyone who tried to restrict his actions. His force of will reshaped New York City, but the distribution of the changes was not even, quote unquote, page 509. So again, out of 255 playgrounds that he builds, for example, only one is in Harlem. People in working class African American and Puerto Rican families were routinely ignored, right? And again, I think that's a legitimate complaint. 255 to 1. But again, racism and that kind of class behavior was just rampant. It sucks, but that was typical. Moses disliked mass transit, and this was also a problem. So as far back as the 30s, they knew big things were needed to be done to help mass transit. And in a place like New York, it's like Paris, right? Mass transit is the way to go. But this is, I think, one of Moses' biggest fuck-ups, is that he refused to have anything to do with mass transit, right? He had a limousine. He was driven all over the place for his whole career, right? And so he didn't like the subways or any of that stuff, and so he just hated it, never did anything for it, which is sad. If he had, we could have had, say, if he put his creative mind to making a mass transit system as great as the park system and the bridges and things that he did build, we would have had the greatest transit system in the world. Ours is still pretty strong, but it would have been so much bigger and even broader and would have been updated sooner. Anyway, I'm going on, because when I got on the first couple of trains going to Art and Design in 1975, man, those fucking trains were from 1930. They were. Most of them, not even half of them, most of them were stinky, old, shitty-ass trains in 1975. But such is life. Anyway, the part that he built as part of the development, he talks about something near by the Harlem section, page 558. That part was kind of underfunded and deliberately underdeveloped. When Moses did buy a playground in Harlem, it was decorated with monkeys. You know, in my opinion, that's just fucked up. Straight up, fucked up. Page 560, that's a real shitty move. Anyway, the wealthy elite of the city, however, loved and celebrated all of Moses' work. He became a national figure around this time. Page 571 of the book. He was like on Time Magazine, and again, he became a real kind of a folk hero. And again, for the big things, if you didn't know, some of the details and stuff, he was getting shit done. And that was the name of the article. It was either in Time or one of those. But he was known as the guy to get things done. Chapter 26, two brothers. He had a brother named Paul. They were both in the mother's will. Moses' attitude toward his brother was his attitude similarly to his family. He avoided them at all costs. Even his beloved wife, Mary, was gradually alienated by him over his decades in power. He had many affairs outside of his marriage. As he, quote, grew louder, Mary, quote, grew quieter. Page 603. Mary aged quickly and developed an alcohol problem. Part 5, chapter 27 and 28, I got highlights. 28, the warp on the loom. Public authorities, such as the Port Authority, typically exist to accomplish a single distinct project and then are resolved. Moses recognized that those authorities could be used to great advantage, and that's really where he took off. Moses simply reinvested the money, made this authority big enough, and was able to keep reinvesting the money, but not closing it down or shutting it down. As we know, it became part of New York City. But for the first, 20 years, he ran it and was the kingpin and didn't have to go to the legislature for money and all those things. But he wrote the law so that only people who could challenge the power of the authority would be the bondholder or the bond provider, meaning either himself as the head of the authority or the bank, which would never challenge him, right? Because this is a huge amount of revenue for them. By changing the law, Moses gave himself, quote, the powers of a sovereign state. Page 623, if you want to check it out. Skip over that part. Chapter 29. And when the last law was done, in 1939, a proposed solution to the traffic problem in New York was to build a highway and a tunnel in southern Manhattan, and Moses refused LaGuardia's suggestion because Moses hated tunnels. Again, that was just like a preference, right? He liked bridges, he hated tunnels. And rather than a tunnel, Moses wanted to build 2 bridges. But the truly significant revelation about the battle was that it had taken the president to stop Moses. Page 676. That was the one where they had to get President Roosevelt in and his wife Eleanor and all this stuff in this big battle they were having over the tunnel. The tunnel was built, but Moses, I don't think, was too involved. But again, I forgot most of this, so again, we're at about 25 minutes here. Hopefully, it's chapter 30. Revenge. After losing the Battery Park project, again, and he was pissed, Moses was still determined to close down the aquarium because so many people loved it. And again, this was one of those things that kind of broke my heart. It was just kind of shitty. There was this little aquarium down there in Battery Park. We know now the one is in Coney Island, much harder to get to, etc. And in an act of revenge, he fucked with him. At page 678, you can check it out, 681. He simply declared the aquarium obsolete and started to tear it down. Chapter 31, Monopoly. During World War II, the Tunnel Authority struggled to generate revenue, and obviously lots of resources rerouted. The Brooklyn Battery Tunnel, which connected Manhattan and Brooklyn, was a success, even if Moses publicly disparaged it. Chapter 32. President Roosevelt died in 1945. At the same time, Mayor LaGuardia was sick and was dying. LaGuardia passed away in 1947 from, I think, like pancreatic cancer or something like that. I can't remember. I don't see it here. Chapter 33. Leading out the regiment. Post-war America embarked on a campaign of urban renewal and an unprecedented program of investment in rebuilding derelict neighborhoods. Moses was appointed as the vaguely defined city construction coordinator. Since there was no definition of the position's powers, he could write the definition himself. Page 704. Moses' spending was cloaked in secrecy thanks to the nature of the authority that he ran. Moses placed his vast funds at Shanahan's disposal by using his bank, Shanahan's bank, he's talked about in the book. Among these beneficiaries was Chase Manhattan Bank, operated by the Rockefeller family. Moses also allied with labor unions, construction firms, and automobile manufacturers. Again, he was the source of so many jobs and ongoing things, even for the unions that they had he worked with them fairly well. Chapter 34, Moses and the mayors. However, Moses' failure to sell bonds for the development of the Idlewild Airport project, which is now Kennedy, right, resulted in significant gaps in Moses' support. This fueled, he secured a huge donation from John D. Rockefeller, and this fueled Moses' arrogance and his sense of domination over O'Dwyer, the mayor at the time. O'Dwyer had appointed Moses as head of the mayor's committee on slum clearance. The federal Title I legislation granted Moses the power of eminent domain, allowing him to seize properties from private individuals. In 1950, O'Dwyer was in such a jackpot, he had to run down to Mexico. Despite that association, O'Dwyer's resignation made Moses' power actually even greater. A Tammany Hall politician named Vincent Impellitteri, who was regarded as an amiable but slow-witted guy, became mayor. I don't even remember reading that at all. Page 788. And he allied himself with Moses, and since he was kind of feckless, Moses ran roughshod over him quite a bit and got everything he wanted. Chapter 35, RM. Moses worked hard to execute his plans. He took occasional vacations, but he remained as tireless at 70 as he was at 30. But over time, he was also losing his hearing. He refused to wear a hearing aid and eventually could not use the telephone. Chapter 36, the Meat Axe. Increasingly, Moses sought to build his highways through rather than around the heart of the city. Page 838. Again, we're getting close to the end here, too. I think we have 40 chapters and we're on 36. We're just at about a half an hour. One such highway was the Cross-Bronx Expressway. This immense project discussed around page 842. And another project, the Verrazano-Narrows Bridge. Again, just that massive suspension bridge. That was another wonder. Chapter 37, one particular mile of the Cross-Bronx Expressway passes through the East Tremont neighborhood. And this was a neighborhood that unfortunately got crushed, that maybe could have been saved if they worked around it. And in the book, he spends a decent amount of time on it. Tremont Street's talked about page 853, 857. Moses did not care about the community. He just didn't want to hear from people. He didn't care. He issued eviction notices in 1950 so he could begin work. Chapter 38, 1 mile afterward. Though Moses rushed to evict people of East Tremont, the funding for the road was still not in place. Project costs were mounting rapidly and could no longer be concealed. At this time, traffic congestion was also becoming worse. Chapter 39, The Highwayman. The end of World War II caused cars to explode in popularity, and New York streets rapidly filled with cars. He tried to plan anything resembling a future. He did not want to consider mass transit, even when the costs were low and would save the city billions, with a B, of future dollars. Even then, when the cars were clearly exploding, he still fought a tooth and nail. He refused to implement even the most sensible, most viable plan, just because he didn't like it, didn't want it. This is all around page 908. Chapter 40, this is probably a couple more. Point of no return. The Triborough and the Port Authority had more than enough funds available to build modern and future-proof public transportation in the city that would have benefited millions of people. Okay, that's quite a bit, so I'm just going to read that again. Triborough and the Port Authority had more than enough funds available to build a modern and future-proof public transportation system in the city that would benefit millions of people. But Moses refused to even entertain the idea. Everything instead was spent on facilities for the automobile. Page 930. Again, we're getting close to the end. The New York train systems were actively harmful and depressing for those who rode them. The companies who ran them were all either bankrupt or teetering on the brink. Page 939. As such, 1955, 5 years before we were all born, was a point of no return for the city. This was the year when the city could have built a mass transit system, but instead doomed itself to be a car city. Even buses, for Moses, were completely excluded. Chapter 7, Part 7, the loss of power. Chapter 41, rumors and report of rumors. Moses was actively creating slums through his eviction programs over time in the papers and stuff. Though most of the press was reluctant to challenge Moses, a few reporters began to look into the reports and to the figures and the numbers. They discovered that Moses was lying on a massive scale and that his destructive policies disproportionately affected poor people, and particularly poor Negroes and Puerto Ricans. Page 968. Again, that's an objective fact. Again, not one that's very pleasant. The Banking and Currency Committee of the United States Senate looked into the books of Manhattan Town, a proposed public housing project, and found many irregularities. So now the government's looking into what's going on here. The Manhattan Town was a proposed public housing project and found many irregularities. Moses' departments had generously paid the development company to provide services that they never produced. Caro notes that the slum clearance project had cleared hardly any slums. This is on page 981. While the private firms that were involved were given lucrative contracts to maintain, rather than improve, substandard housing. Moses escaped the resulting scandal, however, and many of those involved were not punished. His legend in the public mind was simply too powerful for anyone to doubt him too much, even at that moment. Tavern in the Town, chapter 42. A more damaging scandal came through the Central Park thing. I think you guys probably remember this, where they decided to tear up part of the park to make a better parking lot for the Tavern on the Green. They got local moms and PTAs and artists and writers and stuff, and it became a really big deal. They got some video. This was a time when television cameras could show up, and that whole Tavern on the Green parking lot thing, he got beat down and was mad and seemed really spiteful because he snuck in around with the bulldozers and stuff. But anyway, also during this time, chapter 43 now, Moses was working on Lincoln Center, a complex of theaters, which we all know. Eventually, the reporters succeeded in linking Moses to the Slum Clearance Committee, waking up the rest of the press to the process, to the whole slum clearing project that he was working on. Chapter 44, Mustache and the Bard. This is about Joseph Papp. He gave him permission. Moses gave Papp permission in 1957. There was ups and downs. Again, it kind of seemed like ultimately Moses wanted Papp to be successful because he liked Shakespeare in the Park. It was good. Chapter 45, Off to the Fair. The stories were about the scandals and the slums and so forth, was picking up speed, drawing closer and closer to Robert Moses. Meanwhile, Moses was happy enough to resign from Title I and return to his building projects. All right, so he left that. For the first time, Moses was willing to surrender some of his power. This is page 1059. Moses believed that by taking a job running the World's Fair to be hosted by New York in 1964, he would have a graceful exit. But as we know, that's not real. I'm just going to but kind of wrap it up. Chapter 46, Nelson Rockefeller becomes governor, and this is a guy connected to Chase Manhattan Bank. They got family ties, and Rockefeller was one of the only people in the United States that could probably confront Moses and pull the plug on him, and that's kind of what happened. And the World's Fair was just a mess. Moses' style at that point, he didn't know how to be political. He didn't know how to work with people, a give and take. He had almost none, so the whole World's Fair was just a disaster. Chapter 48, he's fighting with Mayor Lindsay in 65. You guys probably remember him. He was mayor when we were a kid. The Last Stand, chapter 49. Governor Rockefeller decided it was time for Moses to go. Page 1132. Chapter 50 talks about him being, quote, old, leaving him filled. He was very bitter and upset at the end. Page 1154. Lacking a public platform or an audience or power, he struggled even in retirement. He lived out his years in bitterness and rage, which was pretty sad. So again, that's just a quick snapshot, highlight, not ideal, but to kind of give us a little bit of the overview beginning to end. Okay, I thought this might even be an hour, so I'm glad this is just at 36 minutes. So I hope that was helpful. And we're going to do our meeting at this point, I think March 8th. I hope this is helpful. I'm going to listen to it and review it before then, but at least this will maybe brush up some of the things you guys passed over. So looking forward to talking to you guys soon. And we'll see you on March the 8th.